Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those of you joining us from around the globe. My name is Marc Schlesinger, and thank you for joining our webinar today entitled The New Role of Wireless in the Enterprise. Before we get started, I wanted to take a minute just to go ahead and set the scene. Wireless network solutions have been playing an increasingly important role in the enterprise long before the COVID crisis. Now, in addition to the focus on zero trust security, locations, services, and Wi-Fi 6, the enterprise can track performance of applications, asset, and people to support a more consistent user experience and ensure health and safety when the need arises. As part of our continuing Leading with Partners series, we'll be discussing the new role of wireless in the enterprise with Aruba's John Green, Chief Technologist, Security from Aruba's Chief Technology Office. Our session today is part of the Orange webinar series called Business Resilience in All Times. Throughout the series, our intention is to give you information and thought leadership that will support global enterprises through the COVID pandemic and beyond. We have over 20 webinars planned in this series that fall into three basic categories. Today, we are presenting the third installment of our Leading with Partners series, where I will be interviewing technology leaders from some of our partners as well as advisory firms. There are two other segments as part of our Business Resilience in All Time series. One is called The Next Normal, where colleagues of mine from Orange Silicon Valley will be presenting some of the new and interesting consumer behaviors as well as behaviors in society, within the market, and some emerging threats that are starting to impact business leaders in the digital world, especially in the post-COVID-19 environment. And lastly, the third portion of our series is entitled Enterprise Solutions. This portion of our series is brought to you by my colleagues at Orange Business Services, who are responsible for our solutions within the organization. I encourage all of you to take an opportunity to listen to some of those additional webinars when they're scheduled. Moving on to our next slide. Again, today's topic is part of our Leading with Partners series, and joining me will be John Green, Chief Technologist, Security at Aruba. John has some great insights to share with us on the evolution of wireless and what it's going through within the enterprise market. And John, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd also like to take a minute to introduce my colleague, Samir El-Rashidi, who may be joining us to help with some of the Q&A throughout this session this morning and this afternoon. That being said, we're going to go on to some additional housekeeping items before we quickly talk about John's background. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll have an opportunity to both enter a chat, comments, as well as questions simply by typing them in. The chat comments will be made public for everyone to see, and the questions, comments that would be entered will be something that is more private that only John, myself, and Samir can actually take a look at. Please take the time to share your comments and questions with us. We love to get them. So let's go ahead and get started. As I mentioned, we're joined today by John Green. A bit of background on John is I've always enjoyed his perspectives around security. He is a member of HPE's Cybersecurity Governance Committee, as well as being a commercial-rated airline pilot, which personally is something I'm always been interested in doing myself. Not to mention, he's also a judge for one of my favorite pastimes, which is barbecue. John, again, I'm so happy that you're here with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So moving on to the next slide, we've submitted three topics to John in advance, so he had some time to prepare for his comments to share with you today. They are, what have you learned as a result of supporting large enterprises during the COVID-19 crisis? What do you see the role of AI ops playing in the wireless adoption as that expands within the market? And where does Wi-Fi 6 play a role in this new normal? After each one of the topics, we'll pause for a question or two that you'll submitted and give John an answer to provide some additional insights and comments then. So, moving on to our first topic today. At Orange, we've heard from several of our customers that a transition has begun around how to return to work versus solely being focused on work from home initiatives. As a result, The learnings we have taken from our initial experiences responding to the pandemic are moving from reacting to the problem to now preparing for the next set of challenges in ways may have missed previously. Certainly, one aspect of the evolution of resiliency in the enterprise is accredited interest in wireless adoption. With this trend also comes some new questions around security and how the edge is actually defined. John, I'm sure our audience would like to know what are some of the lessons Aruba has learned about their enterprise customers as we now transition to post-COVID way of thinking, or what many are referring to as the new normal. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a good question. Largely I'll tell you what we've learned thanks to COVID is you can't change supply chains on a dime. That's been an interesting one. We knew that before, but it was interesting back in March. Our customers sold us out of remote access points really, really quickly. And I'll talk about the remote access point in a second and why that was an attractive product and still is. But it was interesting what people tried to do there. I think, as you said, we're still in this world right now where an awful lot of people are planning to do remote working for a very long time. Google came out, I think, this week and said it's going to be until potentially next summer. Don't come back to the building. And so there's very much still a remote working initiative going on. But as you mentioned, for people going back to the office, if I look at our own plans at HPE across the world, they are going to, when it's safe to allow people back in the building, they're going to have kind of limited numbers of people coming in, and you're not going to be sitting at your normal work location. They've said certain desks are designated for people coming in, and those are the only places you can sit. And so wireless has, if you don't have it, you're kind of struggling for that at this point, because you want to be able to bring in a laptop and use it wherever you need to work. So it's an interesting one. In terms of remote operations, we look at 5 key areas that we've seen people show interest in. I'm not going to talk about every single one of them, but we'll talk a little bit about user experience, a bit about security, my favorite topic. A big one is really connectivity. And then those things, how do you deploy them? How do you manage them in an environment where employees aren't coming into the building anymore, and you may not have physical access to much of anything? The user experience has kind of been one of the biggest ones. There are people, and I'm one of them, who are very accustomed to remote work. I'm in my home office here in Northern Virginia. This is where I work every single day, and this is my full-time work location. And so pandemic comes along, it's nothing different for me. And my entire team, save one guy, is actually remote. And so no real drastic change for us, other than maybe more people at home than we're used to. There is a contingent of people who are accustomed to kind of hybrid. Sometimes I'm in the office, sometimes I'm out. Sales employees might be one. People that travel and are accustomed to using a VPN client occasionally, or dealing with things from a remote perspective. But there's a huge contingent of people who never work from home, who are on a desktop PC, or just are never operating outside the 4 walls of the building. And this has been a huge shock for them. And so the challenge for IT has been, how do I give those people as much of a user experience that's similar to what's in the corporate office as we possibly can? And that can be kind of tough. And we'll talk about some of those possible solutions. One of the big things that comes up right away is security, and for people where in regulated industries, compliance as well. If I need to allow this sort of thing to happen and nobody's in the office, how do I make sure that it's done securely? There may be hundreds of desktop PCs sitting in a corporate office that are turned on and not being used and haven't been used for months now. Can we make use of those things remotely? There's software out there that lets me do that. And IT security departments tend to look at that and say, we need 6 months of evaluation time to figure out if that is a safe solution, or if this is some fly-by-night sketchy operation. Don't really trust that. So how do we let people have access to the resources they're looking for without impacting security? One interesting one that's come up, and this is kind of working. Aruba is the networking piece of HPE, and then of course there's the HPE piece that's the server side. is virtual desktop and VDI farms. We've seen a number of customers that have said, my employees don't have company-owned computing devices at home. They work on desktop PCs in the office, or they might have laptops, but they can't leave. But a lot of people have PCs at home, or computers, or tablets, or things that they can work with. Can we make it possible for them to get their work done using those devices that they have at home, sort of a BYOD with a home device? Well, clearly we've got some security issues to worry about there. We don't trust those devices. So what people have done is actually spin up VPN, and this is not sort of the normal corporate VPN that everyone uses. This is almost one that sits on the side, and we've seen Aruba equipment used for that. Let people VPN into that particular VPN concentrator, and the only thing they can do through that VPN tunnel is bring up a virtual desktop, a Windows remote desktop session, for example, to a VDI farm. And from there, you can have access to all of the normal corporate resources. You can have your email, you can have internal database access, all the things you're accustomed to when you're inside the building, you can have through that VDI. So it's not perfect, but it's at least a way to struggle through. And with enough power there in that VDI farm and a good enough internet connection, you can function fairly well for that. And in fact, that's how some companies operate on a normal basis. And so that's one way that people have said, well, how can I rapidly adapt to this without necessarily having to go out and buy a whole bunch of new equipment? Because this is really looked at as a temporary solution. Looking at connectivity. So an awful lot of people do have laptops, and they were able to take those home with them or go into the office after the pandemic hit and retrieve those devices. How do I connect those and potentially voice devices, printers, and things like that back into the network? So we, being a network vendor, we look at this all the time. We look at connectivity solutions. The easiest one really is VPN. So Aruba's had a VPN solution called VIA for a long time. It's not widely used out there. I would say it's nothing like our biggest competitor is Cisco AnyConnect, but it's got some pockets where there's pretty widespread deployment. The U.S. federal government being one of those. People are able to use this, and even if they already had VPN from a different vendor in place, they typically didn't have enough capacity in that to suddenly turn up their entire workforce. So some people have actually repurposed their Aruba Wi-Fi controllers and said, "Hey, I'm gonna open a port in the firewall to reach those devices," and now it can turn into a VPN concentrator. Nobody's in the office using Wi-Fi right now, so that hardware is sitting there kind of idle. But if I can suddenly flip a switch with software config and say, "Hey, you're a VPN concentrator now. Install this VIA client as a temporary measure," that's giving sort of enterprise-grade VPN access back into the corporate location. So we've seen some of that happening as well. So that's that VPN session is kind of a standard thing that people understand. The challenge there is what I just explained of, hey, install this client and connect it up. That's easy for someone like me to deal with because I've been dealing with this for a long time. The average employee in finance and marketing and all these other departments is going to look at that and say, "What are you talking about? IT does this for us. I don't know what you're speaking of." So can we better extend the corporate office environment out into a remote work location? That's where the remote access point really comes in. This is a piece of hardware. There's one right behind me that's connected back into Aruba headquarters out in California. This device effectively is VPN inside a box. So it's a VPN client. It's connecting across the public internet back to an Aruba controller. And it has Wi-Fi capability in it so that it can advertise the exact same Wi-Fi networks that you would find inside the corporate office, but wherever this device happens to live. This has been a really popular solution during the pandemic and before that for people that had sort of disaster recovery plans or business continuity plans where they planned on some subset of the employees needing to be remote. The big benefit here is from an employee's perspective, I've got a secure connection back into the corporate site, and I didn't change anything on my devices. The way that it connects in the office, if I have Wi-Fi inside the corporate office, that same Wi-Fi appears now in my house. and I connect to it in exactly the same way. There's no VPN client. There's no additional authentication. Anything that I've set up from a secure Wi-Fi standpoint in the office now extends out. And so that's nice for people because they don't have to touch their primary computing device. The most they have to do is take this box and say, hey, plug this into your router. And most people seem to be capable of doing something like that. And from then on, it just works. The other nice piece of that solution is, from a networking perspective, your laptop connected in your home to this device appears as though it's on the corporate Wi-Fi or the corporate network. And so from an IT standpoint, if I need to reach out and do remote maintenance to your PC, for example, that's a service that is available. If I want all of your traffic to flow through my normal security tools, my firewall, my IDS, IPS, that sort of thing, that happens just naturally because the traffic flow is tunneled all the way back to that corporate location. So it's, obviously the downside here is there's more expense involved. It's a piece of hardware, and so you have to pay for that and ship it out versus a VPN client. But the user experience is so much better with this that people really love it. We get questions then about what about wired devices like voice over IP phones. The wraps actually have wired ports on them, and those wired ports can operate in the same way that the Wi-Fi does, where whatever you plug into it is sort of magically transported through the tunnel back into the corporate network. And now I can have a phone extension coming out to me running voice over IP, and it operates just as though I was back in the office. So, to sum that up, I guess, Wi-Fi is kind of the common denominator here. And if I'm going to have employees that are moving from remote back into the office, maybe back out again, depending on what happens, having that sort of consistent access method without having the user need to understand things like bringing up VPN tunnels when I'm on the outside and not doing it on the inside, that's really attractive to a lot of people. So that was a long-winded answer to the question.
No, that's fantastic, John. Thank you for that insight. It's nice to confirm the foundational and continued focus Aruba has on security into their platforms, and certainly that's a priority for the enterprise customers that we serve. Was also happy to hear about the rapid solutions to help address some of the resiliency challenges our customer faces. Hadn't thought about the remote access point until you had an opportunity to share that with us. So thanks again for that insight. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and maybe take a second and see if we have any questions from our audience, and it looks like we do have one, John. So if I may, the question is, as you just mentioned, a lot of the discussion we just had revolves around existing infrastructure that we already have in place today. What are people doing who suddenly need to react to remote working and don't have time for a traditional IT deployment cycle?
Yeah, I think that kind of gets back to that first solution I suggested with the VDI. That seems to be the one that people are able to spin up pretty quickly, often with products that they already have. So it may, people, especially if people are Aruba Wi-Fi customers already, that hardware is fully capable of being repurposed into something without having to move it around in the network even necessarily. It's really a matter of opening firewall rules and setting up correct routes in there. And now you've got yourself a fully functional VPN concentrator that can handle both VPN clients as well as wraps. And when you don't need that capability anymore, you just turn that off. It doesn't cost a huge amount of money to be able to do that. And we've made free software licenses available to people that want to do that. If nothing else, 90-day eval licenses are easy to get. But we've extended that and even said, hey, if you need to use this temporarily for remote access, come talk to our salespeople and they'll take care of that. So that's been the biggest example I've seen.
Great, thanks for that, John. So moving on to our next topic, just like we were seeing with wireless adoption, AI and machine learning integration is accelerating even faster than it was prior to COVID-19. Being able to capture insights from data being collected couldn't be more important than it is today. Having the ability to create efficiencies, predict outcomes, and provide a consistent user experience, just like we were talking about earlier, all require some level of AI integration at this point. At Orange Business Services, we recently even finished the integration of business and decisions into our organization, bringing in their expertise in business intelligence and data science. We're anticipating there will be a significant amount of interest in that area as the market continues to evolve. That being said, John, I'd be interested in understanding, where do you see AI fitting into the Aruba strategy?
Yeah, and so I'm going to be the first to tell you that I tend to be a skeptic about AI a little bit, because it's the term is overused these days, and it's sort of marketing departments latch onto that and just plastered across all sorts of things. And our website, I actually like this graphic, and I like the meaning behind it, but it's asking, does your network have a sixth sense? And now it can. And what that sixth sense is really the AI, which is really, when we say AI, we're talking about machine learning, which is kind of a subset of AI. We're not at that point of the Skynet out there in the cloud that can run everything, but who knows? AI and paring that down to just machine learning is really good at certain things. It's good at, number one, spotting small signals, spotting weak signals in a massive data where a human may not be able to grasp sort of what the meaning of something is out there. So an example of that is in security. We see that all the time, where you're looking for a needle in a haystack, and a human analyst may not be able to see that needle that's sitting out there, where machine learning could actually spot that and say, hey, this correlates over here. In Wi-Fi, we're using it now in something we call AI ops, and it's not just Wi-Fi, it's sort of network operations in general, but it's saying, can we, based on past history, and we've got a lot of customers with this capability turned on out there, we've got a lot of learnings from that to fill out the data set. Can we use that to help other customers who may be experiencing a problem but don't know it yet, to figure out that problem is happening and get it corrected, or to predict that a problem is about to occur before it actually occurs, based on seeing signals that are coming from previous instances. So this is a topic unto itself, but I tried to pick out one example that was kind of easy to understand. And the example here is a big box retail store that has internal Wi-Fi. It's supporting internal devices and customers and that sort of thing. And the problem that they found they were having, they didn't know why it was happening, but what they found, poor performance in some cases. And the issue was actually people outside the building walking by the front of the building with Wi-Fi devices that were connecting into their network, and they were connecting obviously at low speed, and it was essentially dragging down the overall network performance. They didn't know why they had this problem, and through some machine learning with Aruba's AI ops, they were able to figure that out. That, hey, the problem really occurs on this group of APs. Now, what does this group of APs have in common? It's facing the front of the building. What sorts of users are connecting to that? Well, we see this range of users with this range of signal strength. Maybe that's the common issue. So it clustered those access points into their own cluster from the other ones in the store that weren't experiencing the problem. It then clustered, sort of, okay, well, what are the attributes of of all those APs? Can we find commonalities? Well, they all have users that don't actually authenticate, but they do connect, and the signal strength for all of them is X value. That would have been really tough for a human to look at and try to sort through that level of data. For machine learning, it doesn't know anything about what this thing actually represents. It just knows there's some cluster over here that we formed. This data looks to be similar to this other data over here. This could be the thing that maps together. And at some point, you've got to have human intelligence come back in here to say, okay, well, this is actually what the problem is. Well, what's the issue, or what's the solution? Well, we can increase the signal to noise ratio probe threshold so that probe requests coming below a certain signal strength, we don't actually answer those. And that is a good way to lock those users out so they effectively don't interact with our network. The outcome of this is they kind of, the word they used is illegitimate here. I don't know if I'd use that word, but They reduced those users interacting with the network by 95%, and they were able to increase capacity on the network by 25% without having to put in new hardware, just by making those tuning adjustments based on this sort of a problem. Then you extend that out, because that's linked up into the cloud, into Aruba Central. We can kind of define that as a generic solution. If you're an organization that has a structure that looks like this big box retail, and you see this sort of a pattern, maybe the solution to your problem is the same as that one, or maybe you haven't noticed that there's a problem yet. But if we were to recommend this particular change, we would head off that problem before it occurs, or fix a problem that you didn't even know that you had. So by being able to share data within the cloud, and this is, it's anonymized data, but being able to share that amongst different customers and say, that facility over there, that building where these APs are deployed, looks like this building over here from an RF perspective. We see some commonalities there. Maybe the solution that was deployed over here that improved performance ought to be turned on over here. That's kind of what this whole thing gets at. So that was one example of many of ways that you can apply machine learning to bring about these sorts of outcomes. And again, this is a case where the IT administrator here didn't really have any prior knowledge about this, didn't have to spend time on this. There wasn't a lot of analysis done. It was really just a machine learning algorithm saying, well, there's a cluster over here that I see, and this cluster correlates. What do we do about that? So another, to switch gears just a little bit, that's AI ops. ClearPass Device Insight is another product of ours that's making use of AI and machine learning, but attempting to solve a different type of a problem. And this is the problem of what is connected to my network. How do I discover what's on the network? How do I discover then what those devices are doing? And can I then turn that into rules for the network to say, well, let's enforce those? And that becomes particularly important with IoT. We don't always so much care about, the laptops and the tablets and the things that have users attached to them that have good authentication data associated with them. But there's tons and tons of devices out there, building control systems and medical devices and HVAC controllers and these sorts of things. And you often, when these things get plugged in without the knowledge of IT, by people who aren't necessarily skilled in IT, think about all the flat panel television screens getting deployed into conference rooms. Facilities department comes and puts those in. They see an Ethernet port on the television set. They see an Ethernet port down on the wall. Well, we better connect those things together, or else the TV doesn't function. So they do that, and now these things are on your network, and probably nobody talked to IT. They probably didn't check with security. What's the danger of those devices? So ClearPass Device Insight tries to use machine learning to go out and say, to take a step back, ClearPass as a product has been around for a while and has always had this profiling capability. And so profiling looked at sort of discrete signatures like DHCP fingerprints to say, well, this device over here is Windows 10. That's fine. But the IoT gets in, we started seeing a lot of generic devices coming out saying, this is an ARM CPU, it's running Linux, and that's all we know about it. So is it a Raspberry Pi or is it a medical device? We're not really sure. ClearPass Device Insight tries to apply machine learning to that to say not only the DHCP fingerprint, but things like time of use, how many bytes are being transmitted upstream and downstream, what destinations is it talking to, what DNS lookups are being done, what protocols are in use. All of these things kind of form a picture of what that device is. And again, if I can cluster those, if I can say from a machine learning standpoint, these things over here are doing very similar activities. Now, they're not going to be a 100% match. And that's another place machine learning is really good, is dealing with things that are kind of fuzzy in nature. It's not sort of a 1 or a 0. It's sometimes a 1 and sometimes a 0. Static signature matching doesn't deal with that very well. It's looking for something that's always the same, versus machine learning can say, well, it's, these things are similar enough that we think they form into one cluster. So example of that would be a hospital that, has deployed this service, and they said, we have these 8 unknown devices out there that we saw. Once they finally looked at the traffic patterns and were able to look through this product and say, oh, it's talking to these destinations out here on one of them. Oh, that's a particle accelerator from the nuclear medicine department. Oh, there's 8 of those on the network. We didn't know what those were before. Now that we've identified one of them, because of the machine learning did this clustering, we said, oh, all 8 of them, that's what they are. That data then gets uploaded into Aruba's cloud solution. And the next time a customer sees, a different customer sees a similar sort of fingerprint around that device, we're going to be able to suggest to them, hey, 80% probability this is a particle accelerator for, in the nuclear medicine department. 20% chance this is a sprinkler controller for your outside irrigation. Which one applies to you? And at that point, a human can usually say, oh, well, yeah, this is a sprinkler controller because I'm not a hospital and I wouldn't have a particle accelerator. So that's another way that machine learning can step in and sort of help out with network operations. And again, people think AI and they say, well, what's that going to do to my job? Is some automation going to replace what I do? No, these are decision assistance tools. These are things that make it easier for a human to do their job. It doesn't replace them, because at the end of the day, somebody who understands this needs to step in and say, okay, based on the data that's been gathered by the ML, this is the right decision over here versus this over here. Make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense, John. The example that you gave, I think it makes a lot of relevant sense from the standpoint of how people are actually going to be able to take advantage of the data that is becoming more and more available now to them, and bringing into these clusters, as you so-called defined it. So that's really great insight. I also appreciated the comments you made around the AI hype. I couldn't agree with you any more about that than you already made clear. A lot of decisions that are needing to be made in that space at the enterprise level now, and a lot of questions and discussions are happening in real time around it. Yeah. I think we have a lot to learn in that area, and I'm particularly interested in watching what happens with Aruba as some of their ClearPass and Introspect product lines continue to evolve. So again, thank you for that insight. I want to take a minute here and see if we have any questions from our audience, and it looks like we do have one other question here from John. And I think this feeds into the conversation that we just had a second ago, which is, sort of IoT related, but on a practical level, right, all things returning to the office and what have you, some of these things that are needing to be taken care of, measuring temperature, contact tracing, and proximity management, those types of things. Are you seeing an accelerated amount of growth in those areas as well? And are people expecting you to be able to help with those types of things too?
Yeah, I mean, from a connectivity standpoint, if you're going to be sending people out to do, taking people's temperature in the morning, do you want to store that data anywhere? Do you want to say, track that and say, I checked this number of people? Wi-Fi plays a natural role in things like that, where I've got to suddenly put people where they weren't before, and if they need to have some type of a connection there, that makes a lot of sense. Probably the more interesting one is the contact tracing, and there's been a lot of interest in that type of a solution. We've got some demos out there that we can show to you. Because Wi-Fi inherently is capable of doing location tracking, and because most people are carrying wireless devices with them as they move around a facility, we can get a record of kind of who was where at what time and which people were together. We've already done things like this for conference room usage before for some companies that have deployed it, where we know if somebody's in a conference room or not in a conference room. We can determine that through both proximity sensors, but also just through plain old Wi-Fi. And Wi-Fi, of course, isn't inherently 100% accurate. But if you augment that with things like Bluetooth, a lot of our latest Wi-Fi access points have Bluetooth low energy radios inside those. that can also interact with Bluetooth devices. Now you can get very precise in terms of where people have been and what they've been doing. So combining that with Aruba Central, there's actually a tab, I think, in Aruba Central now that is for contact tracing specifically. So I think that's probably the most interesting use case of where we've applied Wi-Fi there.
That's great. Now it's good to hear some practical examples there. Let's go ahead and move on to our last and final topic of the day. Another hot topic in the industry. It's been around for quite some time now. A lot of excitement and anticipation around it. Prior to COVID, that's one of the things everybody was really looking forward to, Wi-Fi 6. And the question I think we're confronted with today has some of the relevance around Wi-Fi 6 been diminished, right, because of the pandemic. And I guess what that really translates into is, do you still believe Wi-Fi 6 has a role to play at least in the new normal for the immediate term?
Yeah. So I mean, very clearly, Wi-Fi and enterprise class Wi-Fi is something that applies when you have office buildings full of people, for the most part. Everything we are planning for is that what we're doing right now is a temporary situation, and people, I can tell you out of our employee base, a whole lot of them are not very happy about working from home, and they want this to be over as soon as possible. They want to be back in an office building as soon as possible. Not everybody's kind of set up with a home office situation the way I am, and prepared for this, and they desperately want to, get back to work. So the sort of prognostications people have made of, this is it for people working in an office building. We're going to be teleworkers forever because we've realized that it can be done. Yeah, it can be done. We're not shutting everything down over this, but I'll say nobody likes it, or a lot of people don't like it, and I don't think it's going to be the new normal. I think getting back to the way things have been before is where it's going to go, and that's what we're planning for. So as it relates to Wi-Fi 6, the best thing about the pandemic is it's let us catch up a little bit on the manufacturing, because again, these products were flying off the shelf before. I'm not going to, Wi-Fi 6 is a whole hour-long webinar itself, and so I'm not going to deep dive into all of this stuff, but there's a few aspects of Wi-Fi 6 that I wanted to call out that are kind of interesting. And where they become more interesting is continuing on the pathway we were already on of replacement of the wired network, at least in the access layer, with Wi-Fi, and then talking about interoperability with technologies like 5G. Where do I use 5G versus where do I use Wi-Fi is a question that a lot of people are asking right now. And by the way, they asked the same question when 4G came out, so I think the answer doesn't change that much. Some of the technologies in Wi-Fi 6 that are specific to it, we've got 8x8 multi-user MIMO now. That's one way of achieving higher overall throughput. And 802.11ac had some of that. We're just expanding it in Wi-Fi 6. The real magic of Wi-Fi 6 is the second box called OFDMA, Orthogonal Frequency Division Multiple Access. And again, that's a topic that we can't deep dive into too much here, but we'll talk about that. And we've done other webinars that you can go take a look at that really go into the details of that. Things like BSS coloring, all of these things are kind of incremental improvements. OFDMA is the real big one, but the rest of these are kind of incremental improvements to squeeze more performance and better throughput and better connectivity out of Wi-Fi. So OFDMA, I'll talk a little bit about that. Basically what's happening with this, you've been able with MIMO for a long time to share the airwaves with multiple users and actually do that simultaneously. And OFDMA is another way to do that by carving out essentially subcarriers. So within a frequency spectrum, I'm going to say instead of using that entire 20 megahertz or 40 megahertz of bandwidth for one transaction, for one user to access point connection, I'm going to carve that up into much smaller bandwidth intervals so that I can support multiple users at the same time. So before Wi-Fi 6, the picture here, and this is a somewhat simplified picture, it would say, every client had to wait their turn. It was more or less serial. versus with Wi-Fi 6 and OFDMA, we can now parallelize some of that. Now, that's not to say that if I'm transferring a 5 megabyte file on the left and it takes X number of seconds, that I can do 37 times 5 megabytes in the same amount of time on the right side. What it is saying, though, is multiple clients can be sending data at the same time. So forget about 5 megabits for a second and think about 5 kilobits, because it's a smart meter or a building control system or something in operational technology, a manufacturing line or a automated factory, where it's not a lot of data, but the data that it does transmit is very latency sensitive. By allowing 37 devices to be talking at the same time with very small bandwidth, they don't have to wait in line to be able to transmit that, and so they get much lower latency. They get much more predictability in terms of that latency. And so a solution can work in Wi-Fi 6 that wasn't possible to support in the past when you had all this contention. So that's, obviously that's somewhat simplified down from the complexity here, but I don't want to go into, I don't want to deep dive into that too much today on a topic like this. The other thing that comes up is 5G and Wi-Fi 6. And one of the areas there is quality of service. So 5G provides some interesting capabilities that we didn't have before of dealing with differing devices and different quality of service requirements, where I might have, vehicles that are out there that need to do telemetry upload, and I might have laptops and I might have phones that are streaming Netflix and that sort of thing. Can I deal with those all in an appropriate way and provide appropriate quality of service? With Wi-Fi 6 and a technology that we call AirSlice, we're doing kind of the same thing for Wi-Fi. And that means if you're a carrier and you say, I've got this latency sensitive application, I need it to be dual 5G plus Wi-Fi, because we know 5G outside the building, Wi-Fi inside the building, but I have to have the right quality of service to be able to support that. With a technology like AirSlice, we can actually do that now by essentially assigning different subcarriers and different priority queues and things like that. It really gets complicated, but the software makes that relatively easy to understand. So that's another place where I think we're going to see some interesting activity. I'll shut up now because I know we're approaching the end of our time.
We are, but certainly very interesting comments as well. So thank you for sharing those. We are coming up on the end of our time, so I think what I'll do is take a minute and recap some of the comments that you shared with us today. I did find it interesting, the OFDMA discussion. It's something we should probably start to get a better understanding of. And clearly, the relevance of Wi-Fi 6 still has a role to play, even though there may not be this humongous amount of consumption of people being at the office anymore. It's also about devices and having more available bandwidth to consume, or allow those devices to consume as well. I was glad to hear the AI ops conversation. I think that's really relevant in today's market. We're hearing that everywhere we go. And to get a better understanding of how Aruba is incorporating machine learning into the products that they're developing right now makes a lot of sense, especially around the comments you made around ClearPass and what its capabilities are today. So again, I thank you for all of that insight and the opportunity for you to share that with us was fantastic. Moving on to our next slide, if I could, Kathy, is we are quick reminder for our friends who joined us today is come and check out the rest of our series, Business Resilience in All Times. Kathy is going to go ahead and post a link for the entire series directly into the chat window for you now. Please know if the dates have passed already, you'll find the links to the replays there as well. And great opportunity to, like I said, hear from my colleagues at Orange Silicon Valley and from Orange Business Services, our solutions team. In closing, again, John, on behalf of Orange Business Services, thank you so much for joining our webinar today. The new role of wireless in the enterprise. I certainly had an opportunity to learn some stuff today, and I think our audience did too. Huge thank you also to HPE and Aruba. Certainly a thank you to our audience for asking some questions. I hope you found the session valuable as well. Of course, if you would like to talk about this topic in any more detail, please do not hesitate to reach out to either myself or Samir at the email addresses in front of you now. And remember, stay safe and be well. Just remember, today changes with Orange. Have a great day.
Thanks, Mark. Talk to you later.
You as well.